Welcome to The Coolest Journey, the show where we dive sometimes literally into our guests' coolest stories at the crossroads of health and the environment, helping us live better while caring for our communities and our planet. Because let's face it, the coolest journey we'll ever go on is the one with ourselves and the world around us. I'm your host, Hélène Caron, and thank you for tuning in to this weekly show on CFMU 93.3 FM, airing every Friday from 12:30 to 1, and also available on Spotify. Today, I am giddy with excitement. This interview has been over 10 years in the making. I actually tried to book this guest on my previous show, French Toast, but this esteemed and world-renowned McMaster University scientist, author, and speaker didn't feel quite confident enough in his French to discuss the life-changing discoveries from his lab. Now that the show, The Coolest Journey, which I launched in April this year, is bilingual, with most episodes in English, he graciously accepted my invitation to talk about SIT, Sprint Interval Training. It's one of the groundbreaking research areas from his lab that directly connects to cardiovascular fitness, longevity, and performance, topics I know all of you are interested in. Dr. Martin Gibala is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. In addition to his mechanistic studies on how skeletal muscle energy metabolism is regulated, his lab conducts applied research examining how physical training and nutrition influence human health and performance. I was doing my PhD in the French department around the time Dr. Gibala and his team first published their SIT findings, research that has personally changed my life, especially over the past 5 years, and transformed the fitness journeys of many of the clients I've coached. So if you've ever survived a HIT workout at your local gym and now have a love-hate relationship with HIT, wait until you hear about SIT and what it can do for you. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Dr. Martin Gibala, welcome to The Coolest Journey.
Thank you for having me.
I'm once again so excited to have you here. Let's start with the very, very beginning base questions. For listeners who are maybe not that familiar with HIT and SIT, could you maybe briefly explain what sprint interval training is and the high intense sorry, I'm losing my voice here. High intensity interval training is and how they're separate from one another?
Yeah, so I can give a short answer and then maybe go into maybe some perspective on that. But so to me, sprint interval training is an intense variant of high intensity interval training. So it's on the upper range of high intensity interval training, which generally means vigorous intensity effort. So if you can imagine a 0 to 10 scale, high intensity or vigorous exercise is about a 7 or an 8. And so sit would be this intense variant that generally involves all out efforts or close to maximal efforts. So we're talking 9 or 10 on that 10-point scale.
And just so that I can maybe add to that a little bit. So my background is I was never an age grouper, but I've swam a lot with Masters team at Dalewood was one of the places that I swam. Dalewood is a little pool close to McMaster University. So to give an example, we would be doing, a warm up, and then our main sets would be something like, I don't know, 5 times 100 meters with 30 seconds, 45 seconds rest. So this would be considered HIT, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just to make sure that I've got all the definitions right. And sit, which is a short burst, is what I've been doing in the last 5 years. So I'll give you another example just to make sure that I've got it right. So I would go out, warm up, and then I would do 20-second sprints, whatever activity I'm doing. So it could be running, swimming. I don't run, but swimming, walking, running, cycling, rowing, whatever activity people are doing. So you warm up in that activity and then you do one full on sprint. So I was kind of following your protocol in your book, which we'll talk about later on, but 20 seconds all out and then a minute or two rest, 20 seconds all out again, a minute or two rest, 20 seconds all out. So that's 3 times for a total of 1 minute of 9 to 10 energy output. And that was it. And then cool down and then that's it. So would that it is a perfect example of sit, or would you have a better one?
No, it is. And so again, what really distinguishes it is this notion of all out or being very close to an all out effort. We can also look at things like your maximal aerobic power and are you above your maximal aerobic power. But generally, these all out efforts last 1 minute or less. Whereas, as you alluded to, high intensity interval training, common efforts can be 4, 5, 6 minutes in duration or so at a still vigorous but not all out pace.
Perfect. So now we know how they're slightly different from one another. In terms of physiological adaptations, what is the difference between hit and sit?
Yeah, so they can be quite similar, and so I don't want to be that cautious scientist who every answer starts with "it depends," but it does depend on the context. And what I mean by that is, you can stimulate similar physiological effects in different ways. And so with sit, there's a way to sort of get to the same point faster or with less total exercise time because of the intensive nature. So, why do athletes, even endurance athletes, practice sprint interval training? It allows you to accumulate time at a very intensive pace, and that drives physiological adaptation. So, what causes us to respond to the stress of exercise is literally the challenge inherent to that, and that will some you alluded to some of our work has looked at cellular and molecular pathways. We will look at these proteins that literally turn on or are stimulated in response to different types of exercise. And so what we found is, the traditional way to turn on these proteins is with prolonged high volumes of moderate intensity, but you can trigger very similar adaptations with these short, sharp types of exercise. But ultimately, it comes down to how much are you doing and how high an intensity are you doing it? The classic fit principle.
Right. Now, would this mean that doing more sit would be better?
Uh, yes, but I think there comes a point of diminishing returns, and so I don't want to stereotype certain of your listeners or that, but many people are interested in the notion of how low can you go or how little exercise can I get away with or the idea of most bang for your buck. And so I think that's where interval training has really garnered interest because people are asking, if I only do a few minutes a day, can that really provide benefits? Yes. And so you alluded to these 3 20-second efforts. That's a protocol that we've studied a lot. If you did 10 20-second efforts, you're going to continue to accrue adaptations, but at a, at you're going to see less response for time invested. There's another classic in the strength training literature, how many sets of bench should I do? And we know that one set of bench press provides a lot of benefit. 3 sets gives you a little bit more. But, my colleague, Dr. Stuart Phillips, uses the analogy of wringing out the sponge. If you fill a sponge with water, you give it one good wring, you get a fair bit of water out. You keep wringing it, you're going to get gradually more water. But again, it's this idea of a lot of return for little investment early on. I think that's why a lot of people are interested in this approach to exercise.
And basically this approach, and you've mentioned this in past interviews and in your book as well, in your research, it's time efficiency. So we're looking at adults, well, I guess everyone, but really adults, especially you were mentioning that you're a father, you were looking at a way to maximize your own workouts, and that's how you, I'm not sure if you stumbled upon it or that's how the area of sit kind of opened up to you, and then you realized this time efficient way of training with sit could be applied to many other people. Is that what drew you to the study?
Yeah, it is. And you're very gracious in the introduction, but I like to remind everyone that, we sort of rediscover the power of interval training every decade or so. And so we certainly came on the picture. We like to think that we contributed some novel findings to the area, but in a lot of ways, we were rediscovering work that, you can go back to certainly the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the Canadian government was recommending the 5BX program, 5 basic exercises, which was it took about 11 minutes for people to do, and it was based on principles of vigorous intermittent exercise being beneficial. And so, yeah, what drew me to the field, it was a personal and professional interest. For a long time at McMaster, I've taught a course on the integrative physiology of human performance. And I would ask my students, why do these high level endurance athletes practice interval training and this sprint type interval training? And it was a way to get them interested in some of the biochemical responses to exercise. And, that dovetailed with a period of my life. I had a working spouse. We had two young children at the time. Quite ironically, for a professor of exercise physiology, I didn't have a lot of time to exercise. And so I started experimenting with it myself and found that it was quite an efficient way for me to try and maintain my fitness as I got older.
And then as the research findings from your lab became published and known, do you think that's why it became such a larger movement, this renewal in interest in the very short time efficient, as low as, how little exercise can I get by with in my life? Do you think that's why it sparked the whole
Yeah,
phenomenon?
it certainly it resonated. I think we were fortunate that some quite famous journalists, I'm thinking of Gretchen Reynolds from the New York Times, Andre Picard from the Globe and Mail, wrote about some of our initial work, and so that certainly spread the word. And people were definitely interested in this notion of potential. We were looking at physiological responses and some performance changes, but people were making the link to potentially ways to get healthy with that. And some of our first studies were looking at 6 sessions over 2 weeks, and we were showing some profound changes within the muscle, and so that really sparked an interest. And then the work grew from there, including work by others, starting to show that interval training wasn't only for high level athletes. It could be applied to many different individuals. I'm sure we're going to start to talk about that. But
Mhm.
again, that was reinforcing some work that had done previously. There's studies that have looked at older individuals doing interval training back to the early 70s. There was work looking at interval training in a cardiac rehabilitation setting in Germany in the 1980s. So, why those particular studies didn't resonate in the same way, I'm not quite sure, but certainly some of our work, it garnered a few headlines, and that was obviously very exciting at the time.
We're going to get back to that study in Germany because I do have a question later on that pertains to rehabilitation. But I want to stay focused a little bit more on the various populations that you ended up studying. You initially did the research with a group of young adults, I'm guessing. It's just because McMaster University, that's what's around the campus. That's what a lot of studies do, right? You recruit whoever is there at proximity. And is that how the first study went?
It is. So many, these often are small proof of concept studies. We'll often study young, healthy individuals. As you say, there's often ready populations of students who are very interested in getting involved in research. But typically, we will study young, healthy volunteers to start. And then our work has evolved from that. And we've examined people, older individuals, people with type 2 diabetes, people at risk for metabolic syndrome, in collaboration with colleagues, people who have some neurocognitive decline, cardiac rehabilitation settings. So the work really spread from there. But initially, the studies on young, healthy individuals, and many of these early studies are quite invasive as well. We're taking muscle biopsies, blood samples, catheterization, and so often we start there, and the work grows.
So you have expanded your work from that original study. And this is a question that I had for you later on, but I might as well ask it now. Most of my listeners are over the age of 40 just because of the demographics that have been following me. Have you been doing any research specifically with adults over the age of 40, menopausal women, and then the older populations like 70 or 80-year-olds starting a SIT program? Is that even feasible? What kind of adaptations do we see?
So and I'm happy to focus on sprint interval training. A lot of our work has moved to brief, vigorous. So I would say more hit type training, but still very brief in nature. But to answer your question specifically, we've done some sprint interval type training studies on certainly middle-aged individuals, less fit individuals. Most of our work looking at individuals with type 2 diabetes in the cardiac rehab setting, these are not all out sprint protocols. And maybe that's an empowering message for some of your listeners. I'm not sure. We can get into those details in terms of how we've defined interval in that. But certainly there is work looking at sprint interval training. We're talking very intensive exercise in older individuals up into their 70s and 80s. I'm aware of work that's been going on in Sweden looking at group type exercise. So, you can imagine a group fitness program, but very intensive sprint type work. Showing improve. So first of all, that many people are able to do this type of exercise and respond to it by improvements in fitness and many different metabolic health markers.
Mhm. Yes, I'm sure we can do another interview about the whole thing, but I'm thinking, are we talking about trained individuals or untrained individuals? Because you can get fit 70-year-olds to do this kind of study, or you can take someone who's never done exercise and you do this, but that'll be for another time. People can stay tuned. So let's scale it back a little bit. So we're talking about using sit in our everyday life or a few times a week. Is there a minimum fitness level requirement before someone can safely attempt sit, or can they just kind
Yeah,
of?
and so this is where I'm going to go back to general principles. So let me answer a couple this way. Definitely, almost anyone can do interval type exercise. I would not recommend that someone who's very unaccustomed to exercise start by doing all out sprints. It also depends on what type of sprint interval training are we talking about. You've mentioned swimming, there's rowing, there's cycling, there's very intensive weight bearing exercise such as running versus cycling where you can do very vigorous work but it's not impactful. And especially older individuals, there's two primary concerns that we worry about or talk about. One is the musculoskeletal risk, strains, tears, things like that, and the other is the cardiovascular risk. And this is where I hasten to emphasize I'm a PhD, not an MD, but I follow this work closely, and I look at the safety work that's been done as well. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that someone who's just unaccustomed to exercise should start out by doing all out sprints, but they could do moderate to vigorous intensity exercise, physical activity. So definitely getting up to those 7 and 8 ranges relatively quickly. The other thing that I would add is, the our government, most governments around the world right now generally recommend 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, including for older adults. And the World Health Organization defines vigorous as a 7 or 8 on a 10-point scale. So, that type of intensity is encouraged right now in many public health guidelines. But again, the general recommendation would be start slow, build from there, start with some moderate effort, get a little bit of base training, and then progress to vigorous and more intensive efforts.
And as you said before, you're talking about you're not an MD, and I would always say to people, if in doubt, get medical clearance and talk to your doctor and your medical team around you to figure these things out. A personal experience with going all out with the sprints for the first time, and I was kind of trained. I was biking back from McMaster University, and I was reflecting on the research that you had done, and I was going home and I'm pretty sure it was after my radio show, and I'm on my bike, and I'm like, and it's in the winter. It's on Coots Paradise. There's a beautiful bike only lane, so I had the whole place to myself. I'm thinking, I'm gonna stick in 3 20-second sprints right now. Why not? Just when I do, I'm like, that felt, like it was hard, but pretty good. And the heart rate is going back down baseline pretty easily. I do the second one. I'm like, I'm starting to huff and puff. I do the third one. Dr. Gibala, you can laugh at me. It's all good. I ended up giving myself an asthma attack because I went all out, clearly too fast. And to your point, we have to build that capacity. And I mean, it was a double whammy. I was on my bike outside in the cold. I can't remember if I had something on my face to warm up the air going in, but basically, it was all the conditions to put together. It was the end of the day, possibly tired. Was it the best time for me to do this? No, it was dark out, you know. But anyway, all this to say, if in doubt, get medical clearance and start low, go slow. That's usually the go-to.
No, absolutely. And I think, this can, this is clearly an uncomfortable form of exercise. And I think, some people have had your experience, or the person out there who's listening, to the interviews, especially early on, is like, or the news reports, oh my goodness, this sounds amazing. And then they go and try it. And first of all, it's very uncomfortable. They might feel uncomfortable afterwards, maybe jelly legs, or get a bit lightheaded. And there's very good physiological reasons for that. And they think, this is insane. I'm not going to do this. And so I've spent most of my time, or many more of my interviews, trying to say that interval training is not only all out as hard as you can go, gut busting exercise. Vigorous, again, is 7 on a 10-point scale. That's a challenging pace, but it's not all out. And that is much more manageable for many individuals. And so I think that's the easier barrier to entry to overcome. And again, especially when we pair that with what I'm sure we'll talk about is just very compelling research about how even a few minutes a day of that type of vigorous intermittent exercise can be associated with up to 30% reductions in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease risk even greater. So, the public health guidelines are great. They're quite daunting for a lot of individuals, 2.5 hours a week. Oh my goodness. But when you remind them, we do hear these messages that all activity counts, and they're very well meaning, but reminding people that, huffing and puffing regularly for short periods of time can be extremely beneficial for your health and fitness.
Absolutely. And so is getting cold. Just saying. Which we're going to talk about later on. But yeah, that was very kind of you to say it's an easy way to ease into it. It. It's a smarter way. Don't do what I did, folks. Do Dr. Gibala's orders. That's much, much better. And you do have a book, actually. So if people are wondering, okay, so where do I start? Da, da, da. And I thought it was really well done. It's the 1 minute workout. Science shows a way to get fit that's smarter, faster, shorter. And so people can get all the information, maybe not all, but some of the information behind it and a way to apply it. Now, how often per week should people be doing this? We talked earlier about the guidelines. You mentioned 120 to 150 minutes of vigorous exercise that the government is recommending. I know from the initial research that you had, if I remember correctly, it was 3 times a week. Do it if you do 3 times 20 seconds every time, so that's a minute. So it's like 3 minutes of vigorous exercise in your whole week, and it worked for me. I can vouch for that. But I'm a little different case here. But would that be okay for someone to start with?
Yeah. And again, to start, they might even try once a week, right? So we'll often tell people as they're starting out, just get out of your comfort zone. So, the classic
Mhm.
example is your only exercise is walking around the block at night, maybe with your partner or walking the dog or something like that. An interval workout for you might be, picking up the pace for a few light posts and then backing off. And as simple as that sounds, there's a lot of research that looks at that, even in real world settings, showing, for example, that, individuals with type 2 diabetes or who have overweight and obesity, that can markedly improve their health, various blood sugar measures, cardiorespiratory fitness. So just easing into it like that is a good way to start. Most of the research, including much of our own, has used a 3 times a week protocol, but there's definitely other work that has looked at twice a week. There's even some epidemiological work showing that a single weekly bout of high intensity exercise is protective against all cause mortality. So what that means is one HIIT session a week can lower your risk of dying from all causes. And that it, many people, especially when we think about the cold or that, we'll read about these high profile, very tragic incidents of, the classic is often a man who plays in a beer league hockey game on a
Oh,
Friday night. And
yes.
sometimes there can be, tragic ends, and they often make the headlines. But if a person's decision was, what is better for me? Not exercising or engaging in that weekly bout of vigorous high intensity exercise. At least the epidemiological data is quite clear that that single weekly bout is going to be protective. Your risk of an event may transiently increase during the hockey game itself, but the other 23 hours of the day and the rest of the week, your overall risk is going to be much lower.
And I like to say as a coach, I always tell my clients, if that's what people have in their mind, just keep in mind that that person who died of a heart attack on the hockey in a hockey rink could have died years beforehand from not doing the activity. So that, there's a counterpoint here. Always important to keep in mind. Dr. Gibala, you've been featured in a number of places thanks to this research that you've been doing. And it's kind of like the rise of Dr. Martin Gibala as a rock star. But like you were saying, it's really a renewal of interval training. But you've been featured on radio and TV, CBC, NBC, and now CFMU. I'm so happy to say this. But you've been interviewed by Rhonda Patrick on Found My Fitness, which I absolutely love. That's a great interview, by the way. So if people want to know, it was a 2.5 hour podcast, I think, with her. And you go really in depth. For those who are listening and are considering it, just know that Dr. Rhonda Patrick is very intense, and it's very stimulating, intellectually stimulating, and in-depth conversation. So if people want to know more about cell metabolism, my goodness, there's so many physiological adaptations that you go in details in that interview, which are it's absolutely amazing. The VO2 max you mentioned as well, and you also talk about these exercise snacks that we can do during the day, which we can transform into these high intensity snacks of exercise. That's a really good starting point to go in and get to your work in detail if people can get to the book. You've also been featured on the Dr. Gabrielle, never know how to say her name, Lion, I guess.
It is.
Lyon in French, Gabrielle Lyon show. And you were also on the Tim Ferriss show a long time ago. And of course, you were one of the scientists featured in the Time magazine story about what's the least amount of exercise I can get away with. If there's a sexy title for a magazine, I think that would be. Now, with all of this, so you've been doing the talks and you talk to a lot of people, and I'm telling you, you've had an impact on millions of people on the planet with this research. But what is it in your experience that people still have as a misconception of sit? What's the biggest misconception out there?
Yeah, probably. So I would reiterate that the first point that I made of that interval training is only sit, or in order to get these benefits, you have to do sit type protocols. And I know that this is our focus here today, and that's of interest to a lot of your listeners. But
Mhm.
for many people, they find sit quite aversive. They don't like it. It hurts. It's uncomfortable. And so it's reminding them that is not only interval training. You can do less intensive interval training and still see pronounced benefits in a very time efficient manner. Probably for sit, it's just a lack of belief that come on, 3 20-second efforts a few times a week can really provide benefits. That's it. It's probably just that skepticism, that this could possibly induce such profound physiological effects.
I would have to agree, the skepticism. Another one that I've encountered when I've brought this up with clients, many of them tell me, but I don't run. And I was like, well, once again, I'm talking about sprint interval training in whatever sport you're doing or activity that you're doing. You could be going up the stairs. You could be walking out of your car going to a building or a grocery store. you don't want to power walk inside a grocery store. There's too many elements of risks in there. But maybe you're going out for a walk, and that's for me, that's one of the things I keep countering. Like, people, all they hear sprint, they think sprinter, Olympics, 100-meter dash. That's one of the things I keep encountering. But I think the skepticism is also highly there. We didn't talk a lot about VO2 max. Could you talk just a little bit about it, because it's going to be important for later on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that the improvement in VO2 max is probably the most important response that we see with almost any type of exercise, and certainly interval type exercise. So, VO2 max, what that is, it's the maximum rate of oxygen uptake by the body. It reflects the integrated capacity of your heart, your lungs, your blood vessels, your tissues to take up and use oxygen. It's typically done during a stressful exercise test to exhaustion or volitional exertion. And it's the lab marker of cardiorespiratory fitness. So when we talk about cardio health, this notion that most people have in their mind of cardio health, VO2 max is the best objective measure of that cardio fitness. And the last point is why it's so important. It's arguably the best overall measure of health and fitness, in that it's strongly correlated clinically with some of these things that we've talked about: risk for dying from all causes, risk for cardiovascular disease, many different non-communicable diseases, to the point where we can say that individuals who have a higher fitness level measured by VO2 max by this much, and for a typical adult, it might be for a 10% higher cardiorespiratory fitness, your risk of dying from all cause is going to be reduced by about 15%. So there's a very clear relationship there that's quite strong. And when you compare that versus other things that we might commonly measure in a in a doctor's office, a reduction in your blood pressure of about 5 points, a 1 millimolar change in your blood sugar level, those would induce similar risk reductions in your health. And so when you think that, the profound pharmacological or medical interventions, drug interventions that would be required to induce those changes in blood pressure or blood sugar, when you think that I can get a boost in my cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max in about 6 weeks with exercise training, that I think really puts it in perspective for people.
So if we take care of our VO2 max, our aerobic capacity, we possibly could live longer. It's
Absolutely. And probably
longevity.
more importantly, you can live better. So now there's increasing focus on not only lifespan, this notion of health span, which is just, being able to do the things that you would like to do as you get older. VO2 max, it's reflective of things like mitochondria in your muscle, and so you can do activities with less fatigue. So that allows you to enjoy activities more, or not get as tired as you're going about your daily living. So your functional capacity is enhanced, in addition to your maximal capacity. So VO2 max in a way is the ceiling, and also what we're interested in is, well, how close to the ceiling can we work for a prolonged period of time? Exercise training, especially interval training, can improve both of those markers.
All right. So now I've got some more maybe pointed questions regarding age and adaptation. Let me start with one that I sent you a list, but I've got others too. Uh, and this came to me via a friend's father who is 76 or 77 years old, and he does ultra marathons. He's getting ready for the Arctic Circle. I can't remember the name exactly, but he's flying to Winnipeg and then straight north from there flying. And he's going to be out there followed by a pickup truck with someone with a tranquilizer gun in case a polar bear comes running after him. This is how intense this guy is doing his ultra marathons. He is recovering from a leg injury. So now he's looking at how is he going to be adapting in time to be able to do this. he's got his team around him, but I was thinking, well, could he use interval training? Because now he's detrained. It's been a couple of months that he hasn't really been able to run. And I'm mentioning this example, but it's such a common example with so many people out there, right? We get injured, we're out of shape. How do we get back to the shape we need to be in as a time efficient way as possible? And I'm thinking, could we do these interval trainings as a means to accelerate our recovery, our rehabilitation?
Uh, yes, as long as you can find a mobility that's not going to exacerbate the injury. So, in this case, it sounded, I believe you said a leg injury. So I'll just give you a personal anecdote. I'm nowhere near the endurance athlete that your friend's father is, by the sounds of it. But nor am I a very good hockey player. But I routinely play ice hockey with a group of colleagues on Friday, and I injured my foot in a game. I took a slap shot off my boot, and I broke a small bone in my foot. So even cycling was painful for me. Certainly running was out of the question, and skating was. And so basically, I tried to do vigorous upper body exercise. At where the place where I work, we have upper body ergometers, which is actually designed for many clients who have spinal cord injury. But sometimes I would just sit behind my exercise bike at home and use my arms and pedal the pedals with my hands. And so I could get my heart rate up quite into the vigorous range. That was providing a cardiovascular stimulus to my heart. And so I was at least able to maintain my central fitness, my overall cardiovascular conditioning, even though, my legs might be detraining in a particular sport. There's, what we call central adaptations, your heart mainly, and local adaptations in your muscle that are both important. But to answer your question, yes, as long as you could modify an activity to avoid the injured part of the body, get up again. The key there is getting into the vigorous intensity range. It can be a way to maintain fitness while you're recovering. As you would know, water running is another very popular protocol. People think, oh, running in the water, how hard can that be? Try it. It's very challenging if you've done it.
Yeah, I actually taught it for almost a year, water running. This was early 90s, but Donovan Bailey, I think, is the one who ended up tearing his Achilles tendon before it was about a year before the Olympics. And everyone was like, oh my God, he's out. He'll never be able to go, to run at the same level again. I can't remember if was it Donovan Bailey or someone else on his team. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It was someone in Oakville, one of the sprinters in Oakville. He ended up getting the surgery to reattach the tendon. And I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 months. He was in the pool, water running, as soon as the surgery site was healed and is safe to go in the water. And he was doing water running, and he credits the water running to keeping his fitness. So to your point, keeping the central fitness up, running VO2 max is essential. And then from there, figuring out in time, like for your foot, you couldn't weight bear, I'm pretty sure, or limited weight bearing. So in time, how do you reintegrate the leg into and leg muscles in the exercise? And then, your VO2 max is always there to fall back on.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And just in a different model, there's a lot of interest right now in surgical prehabilitation. So even in, for example, individuals going in for cancer surgery, this has been quite touted in the UK, where individuals will engage in fairly vigorous exercise to try and raise their cardiorespiratory fitness in advance of surgery, because surgery is a massive insult to the body. And the data is quite clear that individuals go into surgery with a higher cardiorespiratory fitness tend to have better outcomes. Their hospital stays can be reduced. So this can be applied to many different settings, both in a rehabilitative context and in a prehabilitative context as well.
so for many of my listeners, I know that hip replacement is actually a big thing between 50 and 75. And yeah, there's a few people who have written me to say, "Hey, can I do an interval training after I get my new hip?" But basically, what you would say is perhaps consider increasing VO2 max before the surgery so that it would be a faster recovery afterwards?
Yeah, again, and obviously, depending on the hip injury, exercise can be quite contraindicated, but that idea of upper body exercise for sure, if there's a way to boost your fitness going into surgery, I think generally speaking, that's going to be associated with more positive outcomes, and I think many physicians would concur with that type of approach.
Hmm. Very interesting, because for most people in the water, the hip isn't as bad. So they could be potentially doing sprints in the water, even if it's just 2 or 3 sprints or whatever they feel comfortable in doing once a week, maybe, or 2 or 3 times a week. And that could increase their VO2 max.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point, and it's a theme we've been talking about throughout, just, a few minutes a day of vigorous intermittent physical activity can be associated with improvements in your cardiorespiratory fitness. That data, I think, is very clear.
Hmm. I think we're gonna go right into the cold because I really want to get your take on this. I'm gonna skip a few questions that I've got other burning questions to ask you, but in I want to respect your time. Um, the research that you've done, whether it's sit, hit, whatever interval training that you've been doing, is it mostly in a lab setting? And I'm asking for is the variable of temperature controlled or variable?
Yeah, it's typically most of our work is in a lab setting. So you're talking, environments of 20, 21 degrees Celsius or so. We have done some work outside of a laboratory in a real life setting, but I would say generally we're talking thermoneutral environments, or at least we haven't explicitly manipulated temperature in addition to the stress of exercise in our studies.
Okay. So you have been in outdoor settings and more, I don't want to say it's realistic in the sense that people, run outside versus not just running in the gym. And it can, are you seeing any difference in the results, whether it's done in a lab setting or outside?
Yeah, no, and when I say, and again, when I say outside of the laboratory, it's often, what we've been trying to do with the exercise snacks work is make it more accessible protocols. So in real life settings, at work and at home, and as people go about their day, we're using smartphone applications to send them prompts to do their exercise snack. They watch a little YouTube on video. So that's been the nature of our work, extending it out of the laboratory, just to try and say that, can this work in real life environments? But we definitely have not looked at responses if people do this outside or inside the laboratory. And again, definitely not manipulating temperature. So I'm happy to speculate on some of the responses, but it's not something that we've specifically studied.
Okay, so I'm bringing this up because of my own personal experience and personal professional experience as a coach. And I'm gonna take it back a tiny little bit. Dr. Craig Heller is a researcher and specialist at Stanford University who focuses on body temperature regulation and its effect on performance. And the first time I heard about him and his research was on the Huberman Lab podcast. It's a great, great interview. And it possibly could blow everyone's mind, and it might be taking your research into different areas, potentially, maybe not. But basically, his research is showing that if you cool the body, and by cooling the body, we mean you can cool the body through the hands, the feet, and the forehead, so glabrous skin areas. If you cool the body in between, you're at the gym in between your sets. You're doing running intervals on the track in between the running intervals. You're playing hockey, like what you do every so often with your colleagues on a Friday night. Whenever you hit the bench, you hold something cold in your hands so that you're cooling down your hands, you're cooling down the rest of your body. By doing that, it helps to keep the body temperature down, decreases inflammation, and what his lab is finding is that over time, it's not even just over time, it can happen like the day of, you can see immediate improvement in your capacity to do the exercise or the stress. and over time increase your VO2 max. So we're talking about some muscular performance enhancement, but it also helps the brain perform better. So we're talking about cognitive improvements. Now, could we combine the cold, right, with interval training? And the reason I'm asking is because I swim in cold water. Now, people who are listening to the podcast can't see this, but I've got my nice little Ottawa pool. It's a ice pool behind me where I've swam before. And basically, I'm in a bathing suit, bathing cap, and that's it, right? I've got goggles on, I've got earplugs, but that's it. I've got usually no gloves, nothing else. I'm not wearing a wetsuit. So my body is exposed to the cold. So when I'm doing these sprints, because I have been doing the sprints for the last 4 years or so, I'm doing it, and I'm not the only one. I've got other people that do this with me. We've all noticed the same thing. We do the sprints, we get cooled off quite quickly because the water's cooling us down. And we see improvements in our day to day life in terms of cardiovascular capacity. One of the people I was swimming with, his name is Jazz, and he's a kinesiologist, actually kind of funny, but he was training for half Ironman. And he noticed that his cycling and his running were much improved because of the swimming in the cold water. So we were thinking the sprinting in the cold could be making us something like superhumans. What do you think?
I, I think it's a fascinating hypothesis. I was generally aware of some of this research. Definitely, we talked earlier about mitochondria, and I'm fundamentally a muscle physiologist. There's evidence to show that, cold exposure can stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. And so it would be fascinating to study. You also alluded to the fact that interval training is maybe well set up for studies of this nature because there's inherent breaks built into it. So you could practice a cooling strategy. The scientist in me first thinks like, okay, so would the cooling allow your subsequent efforts to be at a higher pace? And so the cumulative benefit is from a greater overall stress on the body. You're able to do more work in subsequent bouts. Or would we keep the bouts exactly the same? So don't manipulate workload, just manipulate cooling and see if that leads to greater responses. So, again, I think this would be a really fascinating area to look into, and seemingly well set up to be able to address some of the questions that you're speculating on.
And by cold water and cool environments, just to be clear, the water I swim in is anywhere between 3.5, sometimes in the winter, but usually 5 because it's the Pacific Ocean, and to about in the summer, I'm lucky if it gets to 19 at Kitsilano in Vancouver. And so whenever I go in a lake, and I'm not the only one, like there's a whole group of us around the world. Whenever we all go to lakes that are warmer, like 21, 22, we were like, oh my God, this is like a bathtub. It's overheating. And so our bodies are adapting to the cold environment. But then if we take that one step further and we do sprints in that environment, so I mentioned my friend Jazz, his performance for the half Ironman. He never expected the results that he got. And I ended up doing 1.5K swim in the ocean, swim Bowen. And I can tell you, Dr. Gibala, I was by then 52 years old, I think. I swam as well as I did when I was 26 years old for the Canadian Nationals, so for master swimming. And same distance, 1.5K. And there's no reason why this should have happened because, yeah, for a number of reasons. I was in a car accident, could not even exercise from 2014 to 2020. All of a sudden, I'm in the cold water and it's controlling my inflammation. This is what I feel happened, controlling my inflammation. And therefore, I can do the work in the cold environment that I cannot do in a gym setting because it keeps the body temperature down and it keeps the inflammation down. So I think it could be an interesting area of research as ice swimming is actually gaining momentum around.
Yeah, and you could definitely build a good physiological case. We know that if your muscle's hotter, carbohydrate utilization is greater. Muscle temperature needs to be very carefully regulated. If it gets above about 40 degrees, that has very detrimental effects. Research-wise, it's increasingly easy to measure core temperature, relatively non-invasively. You just swallow a pill. And as we're not talking a slight difference in water temperature. This is fairly a pronounced cold exposure that would be required, I think, to see a meaningful change in body temperature and muscle temperature to elicit these physiological responses.
Now, in terms of potential using this, so potential applications for different populations, I'm thinking for those who are told not to raise their heart rate up past a certain level. So I'm thinking cardiology patients, maybe people with some autoimmune disorders who have inflammation, systemic inflammation, and they have to be very careful. TBIs, perfect example, stroke patients. Could this be an another area of research for them to rehab slowly into, like, as we were talking about, figuring out a way to keep the VO2 max as a central fitness area that we're maintaining. So we're using, as we were talking about before, so basically we keep the VO2 max going, we see the improvements, and then we can reintegrate regular life after an injury. In this case, when we're talking about the cold, integrating the cold variable in there or manipulating the cold variable, if we're doing that with the populations who are, they hesitate to even work out or walk, right? Because it's too painful. If we put them in cold water or in a cold environment, perhaps we could see some better improvements. Could that be something to explore?
Yeah, again, I think it's all plausible. And I'm thinking of, you may be aware of, there's a lot of research now around blood flow restriction training, right? Where basically you basically put on bands, literally large elastic bands around limbs to try and not cut off blood flow, but reduce blood flow to certain areas. And so you're heightening the physiological stress through another means. And so potentially, and I'm thinking this is a very similar application here, where you're trying to somehow induce greater physiological stress, mindful of conditions that someone might otherwise have, why they couldn't exercise particularly intensely, and seeing a response. In our research, we've used a lot of nutritional interventions, high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, you name the supplement, we've tried it to try and see if that will potentiate physiological responses to interval training. And usually exercise, the intervals are such the big hammer that the nutritional effects are very, very subtle. And so we, by and large, don't see large effects. But it's just another application of using another tool to try and alter the stress. And so again, I think all of the things that you're saying are plausible, and they could be very ripe for study, particularly in groups that might want to regulate inflammation. As soon as you were saying that, I was thinking like multiple sclerosis patients who don't want to raise body temperature too much. So yeah, that would be fascinating areas to study, I think.
Actually, in BC, we do have an MS swimmer, Susan Simmons, and that's what she says. She can control her MS through swimming, so through cold exposure. And she's been doing great for years now. So that's one thing to consider if anyone has MS who's listening. I'm not saying it's the be all or it's one tool out of many. And so I have one maybe last question, but this is more regarding cardiology patients. So in your experience with interval training, AFib specifically, I was asked by someone else, um, could AFib patients, either before they get some type of implant or after, but I mean before, the heart rate, basically the heart goes out of rhythm, and before they get an implant, I would think it's too dangerous to do anything that would bring their heart rate up. But once they get the implant in and it's better managed, could they start to do interval training in a safe manner, introducing it low, going low, start low, go slow kind of thing.
Yeah, and so I think with, and again, emphasizing here, I'm not a medical doctor, not a cardiologist. What I can say is that interval type training has been widely applied in a cardiac rehab setting after different types of cardiovascular issues. And so I think in that situation that you describe, generally exercise is going to be recommended. As you allude to, there's certain cardiovascular conditions where exercise, and certainly vigorous exercise, is absolutely contraindicated. But once it's in a rehabilitation setting where we're recognizing that generally exercise therapy is encouraged and exercise rehabilitation is encouraged, then introducing vigorous intermittent type exercise, I believe, could be beneficial in that situation. But again, if
Mhm.
right now the data are what they are, what you see is, I think, some cardiology organizations are very much embracing interval training as an approach. I'm thinking more in Europe. Definitely Norway has been a world leader in this area. Others are more conservative. Everyone's looking at the same data and interpreting it a little bit differently. So, even the cardiologists, I guess, can't agree necessarily on the appropriateness of interval training. And so once you start to parse that out to particular patients or particular conditions, far be it from me as a non-MD to speculate too much on what someone might be doing.
I totally respect that. So if ever someone wants to look into research on interval training in cardiology patients, you'd be possibly referring them to that German study that was,
Yeah,
or
yeah, and now you can definitely find there's systematic reviews, meta-analysis, narrative reviews on applications of interval training in many different cardiac rehab settings. So yeah, you could, I think, find this work quite easily. I'm happy to have an email from someone, or people can go to my website to reach out to me if they're interested in that topic. But there's quite a bit of work out there now looking at this.
okay, great. Thank you so much for answering that question. Now, the very last question for you, because this podcast is the coolest journey, and I'm sure interval training has been one of the coolest journey in your own life, personally and professionally. So, how has that journey transformed your life?
Yeah, boy. I mean, professionally, it's hard to believe that I'm still studying interval training after 20 some years or so, but it's really because we're not asking the same questions, or we kind of are, but in different ways. So, one of the limitations was these early proof of concept studies are just that. They're small, they have small sample sizes, there's limitations to the research. And so our work has progressed to now we're running multi-center randomized controlled trials. So really what we're trying to do is grade A evidence with scientific best practices around things like effect sizes and controlling or minimizing risk of bias, and all of these controls that make for good, rigorous scientific studies. And so our work has advanced that way. And I'm also involved in some epidemiological research where, literally you're able to look at participant groups of 25,000 people or so. So I guess it's transformed my professional life, in that it's given me a central focus to anchor my research around, from basic mechanistic studies to very applied clinical research on health related outcomes in people who have various diseases. It's influenced my teaching, and in my personal life, it's stimulated a journey and an interest around science communication, and having the opportunities to do interviews like this to try and translate your research for people into hopefully an accessible and compelling manner. It provided a focus for me to co-author a book on this topic. And of course, just personally, I'm clearly a big proponent of vigorous intermittent exercise, and I think it's helped me to stay healthier as I get older as well.
If you were to think back 20 years ago, Knowing what you know now, what would you be telling your younger self? Like one day you're gonna become a rock star doing interviews?
Yeah, no,
Like
I
that
wouldn't have
sounds a
thought
little
that.
crazy.
My answer to that is I probably would have trained more in epidemiological studies and good clinical trial design. I have a colleague at Queen's University, Dr. Robert Ross, who is saying, you need to do better quality studies, and he was right. And eventually, we're getting there. We get around to it. It did take some convincing of the funding agencies and the ethics committees to allow us to do some of the research, but that's probably what I would have done. I would have maybe complemented my basic science training with some rigorous clinical trial research designs.
Oh my goodness, what a good answer there. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gibala, for sharing your passionate and incredibly cool journey with us today. Your work is a powerful reminder of how meaningful research can be and how something as simple as 1 minute workout or some little exercise snacks, just a few times a day, just a few times a week, can have a profound impact on our cardiovascular health, longevity, and also daily energy. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Gibala's work, check out his website at martingibala.com, and I'll put the link in the show notes, where you'll find links to his book, past interviews, and you also have a Coursera course, so people can also do a course online with you there.
They can. Thank you for plugging that. All of the content is available for free. If you want a little certification, you pay a small fee to Coursera, but all the content is freely available, and that's something that I co-developed with my colleague Stuart Phillips and some expert content creators at McMaster University.
Great. And for anyone here who's listening, you can re-listen to this episode again or catch up on past ones anytime at cfmu.ca or Spotify. So thank you so much for joining me. And as always, I wish you all health, energy, and the coolest journey of your life. Bye for now.